Before I get into the subject of today's video, I extend prayers and strength to the members of the Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. As many of you already know, on Wednesday night, this past Wednesday, June 17th, a 21-year-old man, and I refuse to even repeat his name any further than he's already had his name published elsewhere. He went into this church, killed 9 Black women and men in their place of worship. And amid this massacre, a 5-year-old girl barely escaped his onslaught. It's notable to think about the recent discussions that we've had on racial identity and the fact that it's been sandwiched between instances where we've seen Black people dying who were victimized by racism and its various mutations. So earlier this month, there was the covert institutionalized racism of a criminal justice system that facilitated the suicide of 22-year-old. I know this hasn't gotten a whole lot of publicity, but here in New York, we've heard all about this. But he was a 22-year-old named Khalif Browder. He committed suicide earlier this month because he was locked up for 3 years with no end in sight. Nobody told him when he was going to have a trial, and it was for a crime that he ultimately didn't even commit. And then we had this past week the overt acts of a domestic terrorist that followed America's extensive legacy of snuffing out the perceived threat of Black existence. These events are a reminder of why it is so important to be clear on what Blackness is and what Blackness isn't, and who is most adversely affected by the construction of race. Getting clarity on the meaning of race is the subject of my vlog today. And, I'm just going to put this out there. I would typically try and make this a lot more conversational. If you saw my first vlog, I kept it kind of casual, but these events are very important to me. So I had to write out some stuff and be able to just read from some very specific things that I wanted to get and give the audience clarity on when it comes to deconstructing the meaning of race. So, sandwiched between these two tragedies was the media's obsession with Rachel Dolezal. Again, as you probably already know, the parents of Rachel revealed that their daughter, the former president of the Spokane, Washington chapter of the NAACP, was a white woman pretending to be Black. She has since resigned from her position, but she maintains that she is Black primarily because she, quote unquote, feels Black. She states in an interview with Melissa Harris Perry, and I quote, "I, from a very young age, felt a spiritual, visceral, this feeling of central connection with Black is beautiful and, just the Black experience and wanting to celebrate that." As we've heard over the course of this past week, feeling one race, though having parentage of another, is a feature of so-called transracials, and I say that in quotes. Beyond the genius of the various memes and the hashtags, we saw Black Twitter. I told you all that it slaved my life. I should go on the Smithsonian because we're brilliant. So beyond the hilarity of that, if there's any other good that has come from her parents' admission, is that we have been challenged to have, and now, however, even though she's not the perfect medium for it, we've been challenged to have a national conversation about racial identity. Namely, what does race mean? And can you actually be transracial? So these are kind of the two big ideas. What does race mean? And can you actually be transracial? For the latter question, the short answer is no. As geneticists and talking heads alike have acknowledged, race is a social construct, not a genetic one. You cannot be born feeling like learned behavior. I'm not born feeling the Black experience. I was not born wanting to learn how to cornrow or listen to Jill Scott albums or loving Toni Morrison novels. I learned these cultural signifiers of so-called Blackness through my upbringing. The nappy hair I was born with forced me to learn how to cornrow. Beyond her eloquence and narrative mastery, Toni's unwavering expression of Black American life drew me to her stories. The soul music of Stevie that emanated from my mother's record player and gospel of my church drew me to Jill's crooning. I was not born with a Black experience. I just lived it. Now, as for the long answer, I will address what race is, who constructed race, and why and how race was constructed. But I offer a brief disclaimer first. The terms Black and white are oversimplified and problematic, but for brevity, I use white to apply to populations of people that have primarily European ancestry, and I refer to Black as people who present themselves as Black and have primarily African ancestry. So, what is race? If you ask philosophers, journalists, and researchers grappling with this question now, you'll see a range of responses. There is no consensus about what race is, but it is widely accepted that as a starting point, race is a construct that we built as society to describe populations of people. However, this is the problem with the way the media has addressed race in recent weeks. There has been little to no discussion about the history of white supremacy in the construction of race in America. As a lawyer, I am taught that words mean things. So when we throw around the phrase race is a social construct, we have to break down exactly what that means. If something is constructed, that means somebody built it. So then we have to ask, why did they build it? And how did they build it? Concepts aren't materialized from thin air. They are crafted and they are developed. So, as for the next question, who constructed race? Well, historians generally say it was created by white power structure. European and European American naturalists, biologists, philosophers, and political leaders from the 17th century on developed the idea of a Black race. West Africans were not cavorting with their European enslavers and saying, you know what, I think I'm going to be Black today. I like the way that sounds. No, we had Ashanti and Fulani and Hausa and Igbo people. They did not refer to themselves as some monolithic group of Black. And as the rape of enslaved African women occurred in the New World, Black meant anyone with this African ancestry. And certain attributes applied to them, whether they were 87% European or 10% European. Now, as for why race was constructed, well, some people are like, these are just categories. What's wrong with that? Well, it wasn't just some innocuous thing. We like to think of race now as a nebulous concept, but white elites very deliberately and very methodically created race to advance white supremacy and the fiction of African inferiority. And these were used together to advance the system of capitalism. Historians are generally in consensus that the codification of a Black race happened around 1676 during Bacon's Rebellion. And Bacon's Rebellion was essentially a rebellion that was interracial. You had the working class, lower class, indentured servants who were white, and then you had lower class Blacks, enslaved Africans at the time, working together with these white indentured servants, and they fought against the governor. They didn't like the fact that they were being oppressed economically. So they decided to work together to petition against the governor in colonial Virginia. Now, before Bacon's Rebellion, you had different ethnic groups working together. So you had ethnic Europeans, you had African Americans, and you had Native Americans interacting together on a regular basis. They were working together, they were playing together, they were sleeping together. They were doing all the things that you would expect in a society where race isn't really a construct yet. They were doing all these things together. After Bacon's Rebellion, the ruling class in Virginia realized that this interracial solidarity was a problem. So they were explicitly having a class struggle. And so the governor decided, okay, we need to kind of pause this a little bit. European workers got elevated into a planter class, and Africans became subjugated to slavery at birth. And along with this physical enslavement that became hereditary, the European ruling class also created a whole plethora of stereotypes to justify why these Africans should be slaves at birth. Now, not only did these politicians and legislators create and define race, but our entire judicial system built race. Court cases supported the notion that people with even the slightest bit of African ancestry were Black. It was our very Supreme Court that argued that Homer Plessy, who was basically white passing, could not sit in a whites-only car because of his purported 1/8 African ancestry. And so, Plessy v. Ferguson, this was a case that originated in Louisiana. It was a Louisiana court. And back then in Louisiana, if you just said that you had African ancestry, even if you passed as white, they just said, okay, well, you're just 1/8 African. You don't have to look at whatsoever. You don't have to have any trace of African ancestry. And Plessy didn't, but he was intentionally, it's kind of like the Rosa Parks of his day. He intentionally went into the whites-only car, told the conductor that he was Black, and that's when the Supreme Court case happened. Justice Taney and our Supreme Court accepted the notion that Blacks had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that this designation in society was quote-unquote fixed and universal. They were not the feelings of Dred Scott or Homer Plessy that constructed race. My ancestors' feelings about who they were never mixed into the cement of this country's racist infrastructure. Now, what is absolutely key in this discussion of racial identity is this. Blackness was created to be permanent. It was created so that enslavers could say, okay, Black person, your child is going to be Black, your child's child is going to be Black, and until, as long as we have this institution, anyone who is Black is inferior, and therefore anyone who is Black is going to be a slave. To now say Blackness is optional is a contradiction to its very creation. It contradicts the whole reason why Blackness was created. It would fly in the face of its historical meaning. Making Blackness a choice for Africans would have rendered race-based slavery impossible, and would have destroyed an economy built on the permanence of Blackness. So scientific advancements, yes, they have demolished the idea that race is even real, let alone some indelible genetic trait. However fictional race is, the vast majority of us with any identifiable African ancestry will never have the luxury to transcend race to experience the benefits of whiteness. To say that the word Black is now some nebulous concept without acknowledging the strict confines in which Europeans created it undermines the very real consequences faced by so-called Black people. 400 years later, every single stereotype of Blackness built by white enslavers, white philosophers, and a racist judicial system still haunt us. These stereotypes still kill us. These stereotypes are echoed by cops charged with protecting us and terrorists with no grasp of reality. As the spate of aggression and killing of Black men and women has made clear in recent months, and up to this week, we cannot make a word malleable without first getting rid of the racism germane to its meaning. We cannot adopt a new meaning of Blackness without first eliminating the white supremacist thinking that allows virtually all African descendants, whether you look like Barack Obama or whether you look like Lupita Nyong'o. It allows virtually all of us to experience the most adverse and often fatal consequences of racial construction.